Welcome back. So in this lecture, I am going to take up the startup class, the part 2 of this, and we will be defining the middleware in the ASP.NET Core 3.1 playlist. So in this video, we shall learn some important middleware components defined through the startup class. And we'll discuss the developer exception page and the static file serving middleware in some detail. And let's switch over to the video. And first of all, I would like to show you this startup class again in our project. So this is the startup class open with me. Now in this startup class, we have talked about the configure services in the previous lecture. Now this lecture is about this configure method. This method gets called by the runtime. Use this method to configure the HTTP request pipeline, that is the middleware pipeline. Now here it uses two objects, one of iApplication builder type app and one is the iWebhost environment type. Now we can see that this app builder iApplication builder object instance is used to build the middleware pipeline, whereas it also accepts the iWebhost environment as parameter. So we'll be looking into both of these objects. So application builder object is used to build the middleware pipeline. However, we'll be talking about the use developer exception page middleware. Now here the thing is, if the environment is development, we'll get the application with fetch the user developer exception page, whereas if the environment is non-development, if it is staging or production, we will be falling back to the use exceptional handler page. So I will demonstrate both of this. Now before we see the demo of use developer exception page, one thing that needs to be emphasized here is that the order of the calls in this configure method is important, as the order in which they are added to the iApplication builder object, which is the app object over here, is the order they will execute in the final middleware pipeline. Okay, so if this is called first, this middleware, this will be executed first, or this will be handled first in the middleware pipeline, and after that this middleware will be called use HTTPS redirection and then use static file. So the order is important in which the app builder or iApplication builder instance app is calling the middleware. Okay, now middleware can only use objects created by all the previous middleware in the middleware chain. It can't access objects created by middleware later in the pipeline. That means if you come to this middleware, use static files, which adds the static file middleware for serving the static pages like CSS file, JavaScript file, HTML file. This whatever middleware that have been added prior to this, it has got access to the outcome of those middleware, but it doesn't have any bearing on the middleware which are called after the static files middleware. Okay. Now the use developer exception page, I was telling a while back, this middleware produces an exception page only in the developer environment, providing all the details for the developer to debug the exception, and it produces, as you can see through the code, a different error page in any other environment. Okay. So in order to demo the use developer exception page, what I have done is I have added a simple exception. I have thrown a new exception. Oh no, you left the tab on in the index model page or index.cshtml.cs file. This is the index view. So on get method, it will throw an exception. So let's see this in action. Now I am running this application through a Control F5 and let's see. So you see here comes the error page, and where it is coming from, this is configured in the project properties. So right click to pick the project properties, and if you see the debugging, it is in the staging. So it is showing me the staging environment. It is not the developer exception page. So for again, we'll revise this. So Control F5 to run, just to see, emphasize what I was saying. So this is the error occurred while processing your request. This is the error page. It is not the what you'd expect in the for the developer exception page, which is will occur if you just change the staging to development. Okay. Now if you hit either IIS Express or Control F5 to run this application without debugging, this will bring another error, which is what was thrown. See, an unhandled exception occurred while processing the request. So exception, oh no, you left the tap on. So this is the thrown exception, throw new exception. So it tells you the line also within that index.cshtml.cs page. All right. So that is about the developer exception page. Now again, what you have just seen in the two different environment is all due to these if-else block. Okay. Now the changes to the exception page in the two scenarios is because you need more information in the development environment for debugging purpose, and there is not security risk for excessive data exposure. For the production or non-development platform, on the other hand, there is no need to give so much information to the users, and a user-friendly page in response to an error is more desirable. Okay. Now, next middleware that we are going to discuss in a bit of a detail is use static files. Now, this enables, if you see on the mouse over, it enables static file serving for the current requested path. So what it returns is that if you the HTTP request is for a static file such as a CSS file or a JavaScript file or even an HTML file. So if this is that file is found, it returns that static file in response to the HTTP request. And all this HTTPS redirection does is to add middleware for redirecting HTTP requests to HTTPS. You also have the routing middleware, which adds the endpoint routing middleware, which determines which endpoint to execute. And you've got the use authorization middleware, which adds the authorization middleware, and use endpoints middleware, which adds the endpoint middleware, which executes a Razor page to generate an HTML response. So we'll talk about the routing and use endpoints middleware. First of all, let us go over the static files middleware. So coming back to the slideshow, you can see that each of the middleware discussed in Visual Studio 2019 performs specific functions such as serving static files, redirecting HTTP requests to HTTPS, and handling errors, providing authorization capabilities, and so on. Now, as we have stated, this also reinforces our learning that use developer exception page middleware produces an exception page only in the developer environment, providing all the details for the developer to debug the exception. And it produces a different error page in any other environment like staging and production. The use static file middleware is used to serve static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript pages. And if the request for a static file arrives, this one returns the file if it is found. And if the file is not available, then it doesn't handle the request and passes it over to the next middleware in the pipeline. Now let's see this slideshow. This is about how the static file middleware works. Okay, so we have got a web host, IIS or Apache, it could be, or any other web host. So the start point is here, request is number one, and then it goes to, it is the HTTP request is meant for a static file, and this request is forwarded by the IIS or the Apache server to the ASP.NET Core web server. Okay, and which then passes it to the error handler middleware. Now we have seen the error handler middleware. Now if it is nothing pertaining to that error handler middleware, then it actually doesn't act on this piece of request, and it passes on to the HTTPS redirection middleware. Okay. Now this request passes through the HTTPS middleware and it goes to the static file middleware, because that is where the middleware is called, So if you look into the code, I'm talking about this point, app.useStaticFiles, for responding to request for static files like CSS, JavaScript or HTML, right? So back to the slideshow and the figure. So static file middleware, now it traps the request here because it sees that that page is available and it can serve that page as a response. So it actually short circuits the request is short circuited from being shown or passed over to the routing middleware and the endpoint middleware, as the static file middleware handles this request all the way and back to form a response, which is just nothing but serving that static page. All the subsequent middleware are short circuited. So these are down the line of this middleware pipeline, routing middleware and endpoint middleware. So again, HTTP request is made for a static file at number 1, and then this number 2 request is forwarded to the IIS or Apache to the ASP.NET Core, and ASP.NET Core's web server receives the request and passes it to the middleware. The request passes through the error handler and HTTPS redirection middleware without change and onto the static file middleware. Now static file middleware handles the request by serving the appropriate static file and short circuiting the pipeline like this, okay, bypassing these two middleware. Responses passes through the middleware and back to the server, and HTTP response containing the static file is sent to the browser. Now finally we come to routing and endpoint middleware. Now these two are very important pieces of middleware in the pipeline. Again, back to the code. So this is app.useRouting, this is the routing middleware, and this is the endpoint middleware. So together the pair of routing and endpoint middleware interpret the request to determine whether which razor page to invoke and read parameters from the request and generate the final HTML. Now even though these are very critical in this whole scheme of middleware pipeline, this is very easy to configure these two. You just add these two, use routing, app.useRouting and app.useEndpoint. The only thing is that endpoint is also calling the map razor pages method to add the endpoint is actually mapping to the razor pages. So we wish to just use the endpoints by calling map razor pages as in the VS solution, that is this part, okay. So endpoints dot map razor pages, so adds the endpoint middleware which executes a razor page to generate a final HTML response. Now here, what is the use of this sandwiched in between use authorization middleware, in between the routing and the endpoint middleware? Now that middleware is added in between the two discussed middleware, and it allows the authorization middleware to decide whether to allow access before the razor page is executed. Now that's all for now in the configuring the application to handle HTTP requests through the startup class. So in this lecture we have had a thorough discussion about two of the important middleware, that is use static file and use developer exception page middleware, and also we have seen use exception handler middleware when the exception is actually triggered in a non-development environment, and we have also seen the static file, how the use static file middleware works, and finally we have seen the routing and use endpoints middleware, how they help in endpoint routing and which determines which endpoint to execute, and then finally when it is mapped to the razor pages map, razor pages is called, it executes the razor page to generate an HTML response.